Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I got this bin over here that I want to check in on today. I'm going to bring it over onto the bench so we can get a closer look at it. Let's get the camera down on here so see if we can check out what's happening. So now the key thing about this system is the fact that it's very near the end of its life cycle, I think. So I've got some information about the system right here. It's a batch of ENCs, which is kind of code short for European night crawlers. You can see I kind of wedged an extra word into here because this system didn't really launch off in the traditional sense, at least not in the way that I normally start a composting bin. A lot of times I'll start with like a fresh set of bedding, a freshly built bin, into which a batch of worms are introduced. But in this case, the worms were already occupying this system, but they were occupying material that I was suspecting to be really tainted. In other words, I think that this system was going to crash and burn if I didn't do anything. So it was 192 days ago that I took the action of kind of renewing the bedding in here, leaving a little bit of space for the existing material that the worms were occupying to give them a chance to move out of what I thought was the tainted material. And with that, I kind of launched off a new bin. So this one classifies a little differently. In my tracking spreadsheet, it doesn't refer to me populating this bin. It refers to me renewing the bedding. So slightly unconventional start to the system. And I was kind of paranoid at that time because I was having bin after bin crash and burn, major die-offs. So I felt like here in this system it was sort of tragedy averted, and luckily things have been coming along pretty good since then, with the exception of the little reduction of the number of worms in the system. So this system ran for 140 days doing the composting thing, and then it did 45 days of what I refer to as foraging. And for the past week now, 1 week and counting, we've been migrating the worms, or attempting to migrate the worms out of the finished compost. And the way I do that normally is to set up one end of the bin with some food, which is intended to lure the worms out of their finished compost. Because during that foraging time, no fresh food is provided, giving the worms a chance to really break down the material thoroughly. And over 45 days, they'll deplete a good amount of the food remaining in the material. I'll keep it covered, keep things moist so that foraging can be productive, but when the time comes to do what's happening here, which is migrate the worms over into one edge of the bin, it's at that point I allow this stuff to begin drying out. That's why it was only a sheet of newspaper, allowing the material to lose some of its moisture, hopefully making the material a little bit less hospitable for the worms to remain in, hopefully driving them into the space where I'm attempting to round them up so I can relocate them. So now for a while there was another bin of European night crawlers that I was running side by side alongside this system. It was a little bit older, it was 1 week older, but that managed to end its migration 2.5 weeks ago. So even though it was only about a week ahead of this system, it did manage to end earlier, and it also managed to sort of set a new record down here in my wormery for completing one of these migrations. It did so in what I recorded in my tracking sheet as 14 days, so 2 weeks. But what we did in that system was, after its first week, we came in, we pushed things aside, we put in a little bit of fresh bedding and fresh food to help, get the, to help the migration continue successfully. But at that time, we also took a quick look through the finished compost, and we found virtually no worms. So in a way, some of us, I know a couple of viewers also, tend to feel like that last migration actually completed in only 1 week's time, even though we did allow for 2 weeks, and then that was how we recorded it. But it does sort of set an unofficial record, which would be, I think, pretty tough to beat, 1 week to get the worms to just move right out, unless the stuff that they were in was already so dry, so depleted of food. But the way I run things, there's usually a good amount of leftover scraps of bedding bits, probably scraps of food scattered around throughout the material too. So I usually don't really go too crazy prepping for this migration phase. I guess you could leave a good amount of time for the material to really get depleted of all the lingering bits of food and bedding, and only then migrate the worms. But it does seem like you can still get the worms to migrate pretty thoroughly without making the castings that they're living in so inhospitable that they would really almost be fleeing it. I think it is almost better to let them remain comfortable and remain in material that's good for them. And I think that this material, even though it's pretty heavily broken down, is still probably pretty good for them. There's all kinds of scraps of stuff in here. And I think we're already bumping into a worm or two. So that in itself would already suggest to us that this migration is not yet done. But it might be soon. So I just wanted to sort of get a gauge of how this material is holding up against time after a week of migration. And, I think I've already seen enough to confirm that we're going to continue with the migration. But to make sure that it keeps humming along as efficiently as possible, I am going to do what I usually do, which is just to beef up the existing food supply in the migration feeding zone. And I believe that that can only help. And, if a good number of the worms have already made their way into here, after a week's time, it is possible that they could have already put a pretty good-sized dent into the food that I left for them. So even if there are leftovers, it is my plan to add something. In any worm bin, you'll always find that an item like a banana peel is always going to take a little bit of time to break down. So the fact that there's an entire banana peel still in here is not, at least not yet, not enough of a deterrent to keep me from wanting to reload. But I'm going to keep looking a little bit further here. Sometimes there's like a whole paper cardboard tube here. Actually, that thing had been resting in here as sort of a spacer to try to also occupy room without material. So it was really sort of just like an air fill sort of filler to let me build a pretty good size feeding area without needing to use a ton of material to do so. But I mean, that thing's not going to hold up. It's going to collapse under the weight of whatever we put on top of it at this point. But in the beginning, while it was still rigid, I felt like it was doing a good job holding things up. It did seem like the level of the material in here had dropped some. This is a coffee filter. There's even coffee in it. No worms in it. I was kind of taking this approach of wanting to use maybe large chunks of bedding like that coffee filter so that they could easily be sort of shaken off and possibly reused if we needed to. For example, in the rebuild of a feeding area. There's a mango seed. It's really breaking down nicely. And you can hear it. I just tore it a little bit. I tore the material, and this stuff is tough, so I mean, it's not an easy thing to break or tear while it's still fresh. But the two things that I just pulled out of here, besides worms, were the actual seed that's within this husk. I just put them right back in there to let them continue within their natural enclosure. So I mean, those banana peels are totally normal to be taking a little bit longer. Usually the worms will be able to nibble off a lot of the soft stuff that's in there. Here's another one. But the peel is kind of a tough material, takes a little time to break down. The stem will definitely take a little bit of time. So besides the banana peels, though, I don't really see any signs of anything else. I thought I felt something kind of gooey down here in the middle. Maybe it's just another banana peel. I don't remember what I built this feeding zone out of, but it might have been mainly banana peels. I have this sense that there may have been other stuff used in here too, but it's not coming back to me at this point, so I don't know exactly what it was. I think when we checked in after 1 week on my other European nightcrawler system that I was migrating not too long ago, we did definitely see a much better turnout in the feeding area of that system. I mean, at that point, I think a lot of us, like I mentioned earlier, did already feel like most, if not all, of the worms had already completed the migration. But just for good measure, we let it continue. I'm not opposed to trying to break the 14-day record that I've got documented in my spreadsheet, but I somehow don't sense that this system's got the makings of accomplishing that. It just doesn't seem that way to me, because I think we we would have had to have seen a much greater turnout down here in the feeding area if that was to be. But I'm not trying to rush it, you know. I'm prepared to let it take as much time as it takes. So I do want to add fresh bedding, and I'd like to drop in a little bit of fresh food. So I've got a little sample of my fresh bedding concoction. I set a little aside for just this purpose because the main container that I store that stuff in is has just been sort of replenished. So I just sort of laid in a whole bunch of fresh shredded paper, leaf bits, combining it with the old material, so that by doing so it also gets a little bit of an inoculation, because the old bedding that I was collecting and storing and allowing it to sort of age in preparation to its use also had some worm castings in it. So it's not just a sterile mix of paper and leaves, it's also got some life in it, obviously moisture too. So we've got ourselves a nice little pit that I've created down here with a nice little load of fresh bedding in it. The only thing missing now is some food, which I didn't come down here prepared with, so I will have to run upstairs to grab something to throw in here alongside these old pieces to help the process along. Just had all these worms hanging out on this banana peel. I'm just worried about coming down here with something frozen and dropping it right on top of some worms. So maybe I'll have to sprinkle some of this bedding over on top of these banana peels that have worms on them to protect those worms from the freezing materials I'm going to put in, because the feeding I have in store for them is frozen. So let me go grab that now, and then we can pick up where we left off momentarily. The frozen foods that I've got for them are pumpkin bits, and I only bought down enough that would fit into my hand. I didn't want to go crazy here, so I think that these 6 chunks would be nice. But like as you saw earlier, there were still some worms occupying those banana peels right there. I thought that it would be kind of nice to somehow shelter them from that cold being dropped right on top of them. And that kind of reminded me that I had stacked up a whole bunch of kind of neglected materials over here that have just been semi-dry and clearly neglected. So I thought I would dump some of that in here as additional supplementary bedding, because that's pretty much what it is. It's just bedding scraps. I think by placing it here, it'll get a good amount of attention, and by putting it in the way we just did, we're preventing any little worms that might be right beneath these pieces of frozen food to be injured. I don't know. I think worms are probably wily enough that they can somehow make their way away from something that's going to injure them or hurt them. But you know, I'm always reminded of that one scene out of the Christmas Story film where the kid sticks his tongue onto the lamp post, and his tongue just sticks to it, freezes to it. So that's the thing I keep imagining happening to a poor worm that might, you know, end up stuck to a piece of frozen material. And you know, I think by the time the material thaws out, that could potentially be a lethal situation for the poor little worm. So I think just to give the worms some sort of a medium that they can travel through to access these chunks of food from all directions, including from above, I'll just sprinkle a little bit more of this somewhat neglected dry material off the top surface. And it'll have the added benefit of giving this stuff a little bit of worm traffic too at the same time. Because obviously it's going from being in the worst possible place out here on the surface of the drying castings right down into the middle of the action. So I thought that this had just sort of been part of our bedding down in here. And I guess we'll just use it that way, even though being crumbled up that way is not going to allow it to get much attention. Maybe it's just sort of a future piece of bedding we could utilize in the next check-in. So that's where we stand right now with my migration. 7 days in progress, but clearly not done yet. Pretty good turnout you could already see developing within the feeding area, but certainly not as impressive as we saw in my last European nightcrawler worm migration. So we'll allow a little bit more time for this to continue. I was just curious, all the way out here on the edge we couldn't inspect anything because that was just where I had piled up all of that old material. Out here on the far edge, obviously these are the worms, if there are any over here, that have the greatest distance to travel or might have the lowest chance of sensing the feeding area. So I'm just curious to see how many worms are still occupying that far edge of the bin. Yeah, here and there we keep bumping into a worm or two. So this material is still all very hospitable, still has good amounts of lingering bedding and food chunks in it. So I think that the drying of the material might be one of the catalysts that actually helps us reach our goals here. So I'll continue to leave it more or less uncovered. When there's a sheet of paper covering my castings, I acknowledge that as being some protection, but I do so in a way that recognizes the fact that it's protection that's pretty minimal and does allow for a good amount of moisture to leave the system. So even though there is yet another layer even on top of that, this layer, I'll put this side that's got the slits on it over here, so that too allows for a little bit of moisture to escape. I still think that just the paper and cardboard coverings are still allowing that material to continue drying, hopefully creating an environment that's going to motivate the worms to go exploring, looking for a cozier spot to live. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day.